So this week's episode, we're going to develop a background to the quest of discipleship and the challenge that our rabbi has, I guess, commissioned us with, which is to be like him in Luke 6:40. So to achieve this, we must take a moment to examine the source material that our rabbi expects us to be aware of. So this episode and the next will have a look at the history of biblical halakha, or Jewish law, and how the rabbinic movement that Jesus or Yeshua was a part of was actually a type of reform by a group of lay scholars against the educated elite. To begin, we need to go back to the Torah, or rather when the Torah was given to the Jewish people as a nation. This is the moment when we discovered that the Torah and the way it is to be lived, or halakha, are important, as they keep us in the boundaries of expected covenantal norms, or like guidelines for a relationship. So much like vows of a marriage or the boundaries of a relationship, these terms create the fabric in which we stay in relationship. So you go outside those boundaries and crossed an expected or agreed upon idea of a relationship, much like a marriage covenant or something like that. In the past, I held the belief that Jesus and the characters of the Bible and the New Testament only followed the written text of the Bible. Lately, I've discovered that this is not entirely true. I never really looked at the written text as being something to uphold or follow in previous years, so it wasn't really relevant. However, the more I looked at the text, I discovered following only the written form of the text is not exactly easy, as it provides very little details to deal with the complexity of both ancient life and life today. There seems to just be many gaps, and it doesn't kind of give you all the details that you're kind of looking for if you're adhering to a code or a communal way of living. So when we look a little bit closer at the Hebrew of Exodus 24:12, we find something really interesting that expands our definition of what the Torah is, or biblical instruction is. We find two types of instruction that we can identify in this part of Exodus. So if we were to read it, it talks about the Torah and the commands, or the Torah and the mitzvot in Hebrew. So one is called Torah, and that's Hebrew for instruction. It's often awkwardly translated as nomos in Greek, or law in English, but both these terms kind of fail to grasp the fullness or the linguistic concept that's coming out here. Then we have the word mitzvot, translated into English as commandments, something enjoined upon a person or something that someone is commissioned to do. So on Mount Sinai, Moses received two different things. One is teachings and the other is commandments. So one of these explains a concept, the other instructs its outworking. In Judaism, one is called oral Torah, hence the Torah was, one is called a written Torah and one is called oral Torah. Hence, the Torah was written, but the instructions on how to follow it in detail were orally passed from one person to another, or one generation to another. So they often say that there's two Torahs, but I would like to suggest that we don't take that in its literal sense, as they both speak on the same subject. So it's kind of one idea, not two separate concepts, right? It's kind of like one's the lecture and one's the written pre-reading material, or the lecture notes. They both talk about the same thing, but one is giving you greater depth and scope than the other. So we'll find an example of this if we look at Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. So this is talking about the Sabbath, right? Or Shabbat in Hebrew. So we can understand how the oral teachings extrapolate or expand the written document when we examine this. So if we go to Exodus 28:11, it says, "Remember the day Shabbat, to set it apart for God. 6 days, you have 6 days to labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Shabbat for Adonai your God. On it, you are not to do any kind of work, not you, your son, your daughter, not your male or female slave, not your livestock, and not the foreigner staying with you in the gates of your property. For in 6 days Adonai made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them. But on the seventh day he rested. This is why Adonai blessed the Shabbat day and separated it for himself." Okay, so we're told not to work, but we're not really given much detail about what work is interpreted as. Is cooking considered work? Is lighting a fire considered work? What's the boundaries of that? Is it up to our own interpretation? That's something we're going to aim to answer. So lighting a fire is considered work according to Exodus 35, 3 to 15. Exodus 35, 3. But that's 15 verses later. So we're already being told not to work. But at the same time we're receiving that, we're not given a definition until much later in this conversation. None of the written material really instructs us on what we should do or guides us exactly in the depth of how we keep Sabbath. For example, when do we start keeping Sabbath? Does it start when the sun rises or when the sun sets on Friday evening? Is it Saturday morning? We're not really given an example. Well, the Torah doesn't explicitly say anything in the instructions on where it's given. However, we do know that the days from Genesis 1:5, it says, informs us that it was evening and then it was morning to equal a day. But again, we are not given explicit instruction that's when Sabbath day starts, or really any day starts. It just starts counting days in that manner. Well, to answer this question, we have to look like many, many, many centuries later at the prophets. And the prophet Nehemiah drops a little bit of information for us in the book of Nehemiah 13:19. It says, "During this time I saw Judah. Some of the people were treading wine presses on Shabbat, also bringing in heaps of grain and loading donkeys with it. Likewise, wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they were bringing them into Jerusalem on the Shabbat day. On the day when they were planning to sell the food, I warned them not to do so. They were also living there, people from Tzor, who bought fish in and all kinds of goods and sold them on Shabbat to the people in Judah and even in Jerusalem. I disputed with the nobles of Judah, demanding of them, 'What is this terrible thing you are doing, profaning the Shabbat day? Didn't your ancestors do this? And didn't our God bring all this disaster on us, on this city? Yet you are bringing still more fury against Israel by profaning Shabbat.' So when the gates of Jerusalem began to grow dark before Shabbat, I ordered that the doors be shut, and I ordered that they not be reopened until after Shabbat. I put some of my servants in charge of the gates to see to it that no loads be brought in on Shabbat." And so that's interesting. And just to clarify, that's actually going from Nehemiah 13:15 all the way to 22. There's an interesting concept there. We're not told when Shabbat starts, but Nehemiah apparently expected that people should already know that when the sun starts to set, they should stop working, including selling, carrying loads. And it's not just heavy burdens, as we'll discuss later, it's carrying anything outside of the city. But we're not told this in the written text. So therefore, this must be oral instruction that he's received, as well as knowledge of what it means in the written form to keep the Sabbath. So now we've got a bit more information on how we should keep Shabbat. And we have a working model in a city of what it would look like, a bit similar to what we might know today. So according to Nehemiah, the prohibitions of Shabbat begin when the sun sets, not when it rises. And burdens of any kind are not to be carried in the gates. This is not explained in the written Torah. These instructions were orally imparted to Nehemiah, who appears to be the only one who knows how to keep Shabbat in this time. And that's because the people, as he had said, had broken the Shabbat, and he's coming to re-educate them on what it means to actually adhere to the covenants of God. So when we talk about these loads, right, the Hebrew is translated as burden, masa, which doesn't refer to the English meaning of heavy load or something difficult to carry. It refers to any object that's being carried. So it could be anything from a cup to a heavy load. And we're going to get a bit more of the details by one of the other prophets on this same subject. So in Jeremiah 17:21 to 22, it says this: "Then Adonai said to me, 'Go and stand at the people's gate, where the kings of Judah go in and out, and all the gates of Jerusalem, and say to them, kings of Judah, all Judea and all living in Jerusalem who enter through these gates, hear the word of Adonai. Here is what Adonai says. If you value your lives, do not carry anything on Shabbat or bring it in through the gates of Jerusalem. Do not carry anything out of your houses on Shabbat, and do not do any work. Instead, make Shabbat a holy day. I ordered your ancestors to do this, but they neither listened nor paid attention. Rather, they stiffened their necks so that they wouldn't have to hear or receive instruction. So he's added something else here. Don't carry things out of your house. So he's giving us more instruction. It's not just outside the gates, but don't take anything out of your house, he says. All this is actually part of what becomes Jewish law or halacha of how to observe the Shabbat. But if you were to read this on face value just by looking at the sources in the Torah where Hashem or God is telling the Jewish people to observe Shabbat, none of this would be obvious. Not even with a little bit of study would it. Like if you were to look between the lines, you might find some suggestions, but nothing explicit like this. And this is what the oral Torah has come to do, to give us orally explicit instruction. So they appear new in the text. However, they're not new. How could the people know that this was wrong if it was not something previously commanded? Therefore, this message from God is reinforcing the written and oral Torah, not creating a new commandment. So he's referring again to their ancestors or forefathers who broke the Torah and neglected teaching it to the next generation. That's how they lost this knowledge of both the written and the oral source. Nehemiah and Jeremiah are actually part of a renewal movement to re-establish God's covenant with his people. This oral concept has been preserved by Yeshua's rabbinical colleagues and features one of his confrontations with the Pharisees, or Perushim in Hebrew. So the sources that we've just gone through, when you're listening to this, or if you want to listen to it again, writing those down might be a good idea so you can compare them when we actually get to these discussions. This is a foundational idea, and what we have learned here we will discuss later when we look at the Gospels and how Jesus or Yeshua applies the oral tradition. So here's another really interesting example, praying towards Jerusalem. And we see Daniel, the prophet Daniel, do this in the book named after him, Daniel 6:11. We find that Daniel prays in a particular manner, facing Jerusalem and 3 times a day. So this isn't like a particular thing that Daniel invented in order to be unique with his relationship with God. This appears to be something orally commanded. So the source for this will be Kings 1, chapter 8, verses 46 to 51. And so this is King Solomon. He's talking about the inauguration of the temple, and he's got this big, long list of events and things that will happen around the temple, and this is just a snippet of it. And he says, if they sin against you, for there is no one who doesn't sin, and you are angry with them and hand them over to the enemy, so that they carry them off captive to the land of their enemy, whether far away or nearby, then if they come to their senses in the land where they have been carried away captive, turn back, make their plea to you in the land of those who carried them off as captive, saying, we sinned, we acted wrongly, we behaved wickedly. If in the land of their enemies who carried them off captive, they return to you with all their heart and begin to pray to you toward their own land, which you gave their ancestors, toward the city you chose, toward the house I have built for your name. Interesting. And that's exactly what Daniel's doing. He's facing the city wherein lies the temple. And in order to do so, he must face the land. He must face the home he wishes to return to. So again, we don't find it, in fact, anywhere that we are commanded to pray to God. But here, this is just the expectation when you pray, not this is how you should pray. Solomon here is just assuming that every Jew knows how to pray this way, or even anyone who's living in Jerusalem, right? Here we see that facing Jerusalem and praying are things expected, not commanded. Here implying that this was a practice existing since there was a sacred space for the Jews and God to dwell in unity. This is an oral tradition that corresponds to the daily sacrifices done in the temple, and it connects them to the temple even when the temple no longer stands. These instructions all occur around the documented written instructions given in the Torah itself, implying that they were orally taught alongside the written teaching. This idea of prayer towards the temple or in the temple itself is found in the book of Acts, when the hour of prayer would come and the disciples would go up to the temple, or even Cornelius himself, who was at the afternoon prayer in his home, facing towards Jerusalem. This is a fundamental text to keep in mind for later discussions on Jewish prayer and tradition. So the second part of our podcast is going to be looking at biblical judges and leaders and a little bit at types of judgment. So we've looked at the type of text that would form a covenantal society or the law of the land in a holy culture. But now we're going to understand who polices that, who enforces it, who develops it into a society that can adapt, grow, and change, walking with God, because the Hebrew word for law, halakha, is actually to walk, to go forward. So it's a relational, it's a moving, growing entity, much like society today, or human beings who grow and learn. So the question is, in this holy culture, in this covenantal society, was God the only one who judged and guided Israel? Well, in Judaism, according to the rabbis, there are three separate types of leaders. There's a king, a priest, and a prophet, and each one has a crown. So they call it the three crowns. And yet there is another one who's not mentioned, not given any specific type of crown, but no less important, and that's the communal judge. So the prophet, as we saw earlier, reminds and informs people of God's teachings and what happens if they break them, kind of like Moses, hence Moses being a great prophet. The priest, on the other hand, has the power to judge cases and hear people's lawsuits and that kind of thing. The king has the power to raise armies and develop a nation economically. And there are even different types of judgment in the Torah itself. There's divine judgment by God, and then judgment by humans who have been given the authority of God in his place. And you see these in some of the Psalms. They're called the Elohim, or the judges. I think even Yeshua himself refers to people as being Elohim. Here is an example of what we might find. So judgment by divine test in Numbers 5:11-31. This is the test with the bitter waters, and that was a divine right for deciding if infidelity had occurred between a married couple. Then there's something in Hebrew called the Urim and the Thummim, and these are divine priestly devices that would show God's judgment to the people when they sought the priests. And the priests were also responsible for the teaching of Torah to the whole nation as well. They were the educators of the people. Exodus 28:30 says this: also put the Urim and the Thummim in the breastpiece, so they may be over Aaron's heart when he enters the presence of the Lord. Thus Aaron will always bear the means for making decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord. And then we see another example of them in 1 Samuel 23:9. Now David knew that Saul was plotting evil against him, so he said to Abiathar, the priest, "Bring me the ephod here." God speaks to David through this device and shows him what will happen. So these are mystical, divine type judgments. And then we have a hybrid one where both God and man share the role of judging according to the Torah. This is the one that Moses set up with the advice of his father-in-law Jethro. So we can find an example of these communal style judges who are no less important, but seem to be the judgment and judges that have survived to the present day. So we're going to see this in Exodus 18:15-10. The following day, Moshe sat to settle disputes for the people, while the people stood around Moshe from evening till morning. When Moshe's father-in-law saw all that he was doing to the people, he said, "What is this that you're doing to the people? Why do you sit there alone with all the people standing around you from morning till evening?" Moshe answered his father-in-law, It's because the people come to me seeking God's guidance. Whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me. I judge between one person and another, and I explain to them God's laws and teachings. Moshe's father-in-law said to him, "What you're doing is not good. You will certainly wear yourself out, and not only yourself, but these people here with you as well. It's too much for you. You can't do it alone, by yourself. So listen now to what I have to say. I will give you some advice, and God will be with you. You should represent the people before God, and you should bring their cases to God. You should also teach them the laws and the teachings, and show them how to live their lives and what work they should do. But you should choose from among all the people competent men who are God-fearing, honest, incorruptible, to be their leaders, in charge of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Normally, they will settle the people's disputes. They should bring you the difficult cases, but ordinary matters they should decide themselves. In this way, they will make it easier for you and share the load with you." And you know what's interesting about this whole text here is that God's nowhere to be seen in giving the yay or nay. Jethro just happens to hear the wonderful thing that God has done in liberating Israel, and he's like, "Well, I'm going to go visit my son-in-law. I remember him, and bring his family from Midian, and we're going to, meet this awesome God that I've heard so much about." And then he gives him this advice, and Moses is like, "Yeah, it sounds good. Thanks, father-in-law." And that's it. And now we have this whole institution from these two guys collaborating together. It's kind of interesting. And these judges were from the people and also by the people. They didn't really need a prophetic mantle, a priestly lineage. They just needed to be appointed by another judge from whom Moses first appointed, or from the people. So to keep that institution alive, according to rabbinic tradition, Moses would appoint these first judges. But as we've seen here as well, the people could choose them for themselves. And we covered that in last week's topic, that the people could also appoint rabbis by giving them the authority of rabbi before it became a post-temple educational institution on a large national scale. In Deuteronomy 16, 18 to 19, it says this: "You shall choose for yourselves judges." That means that people have a role to play in choosing who judges over them. And we've given this great criteria, showing that people will share that responsibility with God. Today, we have an institution that trains rabbis called a yeshiva, and a rabbinate, like a panel of judges and teachers who officiate a document or an education that we trust to keep that system running. It's like an institution that we've allowed and given our trust to, rather than just picking random people, although congregations still do appoint people by their trust to certain positions. So we see this again reflected in Deuteronomy 17, 2 to 10. "If a case comes before you at your city gate, which is too difficult for you to judge, concerning bloodshed, civil suit, personal injury, or any other controversial issue, you are to go up to the place which Adonai your God will choose, and appear before the Kohanim, who are Levites, and the judge in the office at the time. Seek their opinion, and they will render a verdict for you. You will then act according to what they have told you there, in that place which Adonai will choose. You are to take care to act according to all their instructions. In accordance with the Torah they teach you, you are to carry out the judgment they render, not turning aside to the right or the left from the verdict they declare to you." So he's talking about the same system where you have lesser judges and then higher judges. But the criteria of what they're allowed to judge is murder cases, civil things, which could be personal injury, divorces, marriages, monetary issues, or any other controversial issue. So these judges are given societal judgment, and of course they have to use God's word. They couldn't use any other source or text or way of living. It had to be the way that God has instructed them. This court is to judge in cases of the people. And as you've seen, there's much like the courts today, there's a lower level and a higher level. The higher court has both priests and lay judges. which comprised the judging body. But eventually, the priests would stop, and so would the prophets, and you would just be left with this body of lay judges. Now, we want to see, because we hear about things like the Sanhedrin, we hear about rabbinic, something called a Beit Din in Hebrew, a house of judgment. Is that case law style actually applied in the Bible? We've heard about the system. Now we're going to see an example of it played out here. And that's in Jeremiah 26, 1-24. It's a long one, but I hope it'll be worth it. At the beginning of the reign of Jehoiakim, son of Yoshiyahu, king of Yehudah, this word came from Adonai. Adonai says this: stand in the courtyard of Adonai's house and speak to the people from all the cities in Judah who come to worship at Adonai's house. Say everything I order you to say to them, and do not leave a word out. Maybe they will listen, and each of them turn from their ways. Then I will be able to relent from the disaster I intend to bring on them because of how evil their deeds are. So tell them that this is what Adonai says: if you will not pay attention to me and live according to my Torah, which I have given you, and listen to what my servants, the prophets whom I send you, say, I have sent them frequently, but you have not listened. Then I will make this house like Shiloh, and I will make this city an object of cursing for all the nations on the earth. The Kohanim, or the priests, the prophets, and all the people heard Jeremiah speaking these words in the house of Adonai. When Jeremiah had finished saying everything Adonai had ordered him to say to all the people, the priests, prophets, and all the people seized him, shouting, You will die for this! Why have you prophesied in the name of Adonai? This house will become like Shiloh, and this city will become uninhabited ruins. The people all crowded in on Jeremiah in Adonai's house. When the officials of Judah heard about it, they came up from the king's palace to Adonai's house and sat at the entrance of the new gates of Adonai's house. The priests and prophets said to the officials and all the people, This man deserves a death sentence because he has prophesied against this city. You've heard it with your own ears. Then Jeremiah said to the officials and all the people, Adonai sent me to prophesy against this house and against this city with all the words you have heard. Therefore now improve your ways and your doings and listen to the voice of Adonai your God. Then Adonai will relent from the disaster he has decreed against you. But as for me, here I am in your hands. Do with me whatever seems good and right to you. Only know for certain that if you put me to death, you will bring innocent blood on yourselves, on this city and its inhabitants, because of the fact that it is Adonai who sent me to speak all these words, so that you could hear them. The officials and all the people then said to the priests and prophets, This man does not deserve a death sentence, because he has spoken to us in the name of Adonai our God. At this point, some of the leaders of the land stood up and addressed all the people assembled. Back in the time of Hezekiah, king of Judah, Micah from Moreshet was a prophet. He told all the people of Judah, Adonai Tzavot, or the Lord of hosts, says, Zion will be plowed under like a field. Jerusalem will become heaps of ruins, and the mountain of the house like a forested height. Then did Hezekiah, king of Judah, and all Judah put him to death? Not at all. Rather, he feared Adonai and prayed for Adonai's favor, and Adonai relented from the disaster he had pronounced against them. So if we put Jeremiah to death, we might bring great disaster on ourselves. Interesting. This kind of plays out like a legal drama. You have a prophet, he's bringing a word to the people. You have the people trying to fulfill what the Torah says, saying that if someone is a false prophet, it's a capital crime, considering they could lead the whole nation astray. And then you have this court debating on what they should do. And then one of the leaders of the land stands up and brings a case study from the past and says, wait a minute, this reminds me of this guy, and he was legitimate. And the word here for leader is zaken, which is synonymous in the New Testament with rabbi or elder, someone of a leading communal position. So here we saw that even the lay people have some sway in this community debate that's happening here. And this is what will continue and become the institution of rabbinic Judaism we have today. So the change from the priests to the lay people was a move away from the prophetic domain. This was the Jewish leaders' response to exile and the end of the prophetic era. That's when the Jewish people left Babylon and came back to the land. A group of Jewish leaders commissioned with the task of guiding the people out of exile, called the Men of the Great Assembly, comprising 120 members, including prophets like Haggai and Ezra and Mordecai. They developed institutional foundations that rabbinic Judaism would grow from in the coming return from the exile to the Holy Land. So they asked these kinds of questions. What do we do as a people when we stop having a priesthood and a line of credible prophets to judge us? And that's what gave birth to the rabbinic institution that was being officially formed from the time of Ezra, or when Ezra renewed the covenant, to the time that the Second Temple was destroyed. How did they know that this was going to happen? Well, Malachi 2:6-9 tell us about the end of prophecy. It says, "My covenant with him was one of life and peace, and I gave him these things. It was also one of fear, and he feared me. He was in awe of my name. The true Torah was in his mouth, and no dishonesty was found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness, and turned away from sin." A priest's lips should safeguard knowledge, and people should seek Torah from his mouth, because he is the messenger of Adonai, Lord of hosts. But you turned away from the path. You caused many to fail in the Torah. You corrupted the covenant of Levi, says the Lord of hosts. Therefore, I have in turn made you contemptible and vile before all the people. Now, that could be speaking of any time that the priests and prophets stopped teaching Torah and stopped actually instructing people to keep God's covenant. But if we, and we will, look at the future, at the time around when Jesus lived, the priests had become corrupt. They'd become a bought-out system. And so what do you do then? Well, the rabbis and the rabbinic institution was the solution to this. And that was part of the reform they were leading. They were looking at these corrupt priests, and they were looking at their past going, oy vey, we're gonna become, exiles again. What are we gonna do about it? And so they continued the work of those 120 members of the Men of the Great Assembly. And this is what we find when we read Zechariah. I won't quote the verse, but in Zechariah it talks about the end of prophecy. And a day is coming when no one will call themselves a prophet. And that's starting to come up to the time of Jesus, when people had prophetic gifting, but no one walked in the office of prophet as in the Old Testament style. So having looked at what the scope of Torah is, we can now study it in its entirety rather than just in one dimension of the written text as in previous years. And this is going to aid us to grow in the calling of Luke 6:40, to be like our Master, who was familiar with the Torah in its two different dimensions, one of written and one of oral. The way that the Torah is judged, from God's divine mystical judgment to human courts where people sit in place of God to render judgment based on case law and legal discussion. So next week, we'll see how the Jewish people dealt with the idea with the end of the biblical prophets and a change in social structure with the corruption of the priesthood. And what would they do, and what institutions they developed to combat this? And we'll even look at some of the roles that rabbis played as social leaders, going back to the scriptures that we looked at before and finding how Jesus played that role as well. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.